So, you think you know the story about that recent unanimous Supreme Court ruling? Well, according to one source, what we've all heard is just the surface. They're claiming there's a much, much bigger story with some pretty explosive implications hidden just out of sight. So, let's dive in and break down exactly what their argument is.
And this quote really sets the stage. The source is basically saying, hey, pay attention. They frame their whole argument around this one idea. This ruling isn't the end of a story. No, it's the beginning of something that could ripple through everything, from politics to finance.
Right, so the claim is that while we were all looking at the headlines, the real bombshell was happening underneath it all. It's not about who won or lost, the final verdict. It's about a specific piece of legal reasoning buried in the decision that, according to this source, could change the entire game. And what's the detail that really got their attention? That big 90. I mean, think about it. A unanimous decision on a case this politically charged, that's incredibly rare. And this is the question that drives their entire theory. Why? Why did all 9 justices, including Trump's own appointees, line up so perfectly? What was going on there? Okay, and that question leads us right into their first major claim. It centers on what they're calling a hidden weapon, something they say is buried deep inside the court's decision. Now, this isn't some vague theory. The source gets incredibly specific here. They point to a single paragraph on page 47 of the ruling. They're claiming this is the spot where the court quietly, almost sneakily, established a really powerful and, importantly, reusable legal standard. And the key phrase they zoom in on is systematic misconduct. What does that mean? Well, they argue the court wasn't just talking about a one-time mistake or simple fraud. No, they were defining a whole business model where deception is basically part of the strategy, a core function, and that is a huge distinction. So here's the big takeaway from their perspective. This ruling, it wasn't just a punishment for one person. It was a blueprint, a legal precedent that could now be aimed at any powerful group hiding behind a corporate shield. It's like they handed prosecutors a brand new, very powerful tool. Okay, so if this new legal weapon was just created, what happened next? What was the fallout? Well, the source claims it triggered this quiet, almost invisible panic behind the scenes, sending shockwaves through both the political world and Wall Street. And according to their reporting, the reaction was totally split. There was the story everyone saw on camera, and then there was a completely different story unfolding in private emails and quiet boardroom meetings. And this slide really gets at that disconnect they're talking about. Publicly, it's all judicial overreach, attack on business, total defiance. But privately, the source claims the conversation was all about survival. They even point to what they say is a leaked memo from a senior strategist that shows this frantic scramble for damage control. So what was causing the supposed panic? The source says it was internal polling data. They claim the numbers show that independent voters, the ones who really decide elections, were turning fast. They were starting to see this whole thing as a huge political liability, and that was suddenly putting key Senate seats in places like Montana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania at risk. But the alleged freakout wasn't just in D.C. The source shifts gears over to Wall Street, and they highlight this one simple 3-word statement they attribute to Warren Buffett: rules matter most. Now, they argue this wasn't just some off-the-cuff remark. It was a carefully chosen signal to the entire market, basically saying the system itself has to be protected, no matter what. But words are one thing. The source argues the real evidence is in the actions people took, and they point to this massive number as proof: $2.3 billion. They claim this number represents a huge asset sale that proves some people knew exactly what was about to happen. So what is that $2.3 billion? According to the source, that's the value of commercial real estate sold off by Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway. But here's the kicker, the detail they say is the most critical: the timing. The sale supposedly happened before the ruling ever went public, and that leads them to suggest this wasn't just a reaction, it was a scheduled event. Okay, so from Wall Street, the source brings us right back to the Supreme Court, and here their argument gets really interesting. They say what the justices didn't do is just as revealing, maybe even more so, than what they did. It's a pretty subtle point, but they say it's a powerful one. They claim the real story isn't the 9 yes votes. It's the complete silence that followed. Specifically, the fact that none of the conservative justices wrote their own separate opinions to explain their thinking. The source lays out 3 things they call red flags. First, you've got that super rare 9-0 vote. Second, Trump's own appointees signed on. No questions asked, no visible fight. But the biggest tell, they claim, is that not one justice wrote separate concurring opinion to explain their vote or maybe limit the precedent. And in a case this big, that's usually standard practice.
So what's their conclusion? They argue the silence was a deliberate strategy, that the justices wanted to avoid leaving any fingerprints on what they saw as a politically radioactive case. By just signing the main opinion and saying nothing else, the source alleges they were signaling that this whole situation was just too toxic to touch, too risky to even defend or explain. All right, so all of this builds up to the final section of their argument, a series of pretty bold predictions about what they think is going to happen next. They literally frame it as a potential countdown to a crisis. They predict a response that follows this familiar three-step playbook. First step, step 1, deny. Claim the ruling is fake, it's rigged. Then step 2, attack. Go after the court itself. Try to delegitimize the whole institution. And finally, step 3, mobilize. Reframe the whole thing from a legal loss into an existential crisis for the country. And they get even more specific, laying out a 72-hour countdown. In the first 24 hours, they predict a final legal push, mostly for show. Then, from 24 to 48 hours, Congress gets forced to pick a side. And all of that leads to this critical inflection point somewhere around the 72-hour mark, the big choice between compliance and outright defiance. And that brings us to the two very, very different paths forward that the source lays out. Path 1 is compliance. Yeah, it would mean years of messy courtroom battles, but ultimately the system holds. Path 2 is defiance, and they argue that would trigger a full-blown constitutional crisis, raising this wild, unprecedented question: how do you even enforce a Supreme Court order against a former president? And this really brings us back full circle to their central argument, right? Why this is supposedly bigger than just one person. The source claims this precedent against systematic deception could be like the first domino to fall. It could potentially be applied to a whole bunch of other things: super PACs, dark money groups, any structure built to hide money and influence. That, they argue, is why the supposed panic is so widespread. And so their entire analysis really boils down to this one very provocative question. Was all of it, the timing of the real estate sales, that 9-0 ruling, the political scrambling, was it all just a massive coincidence? Or, as the source suggests, does it point to something coordinated, a sequence of events unfolding behind the curtain? They don't give an answer. They leave it up to you to decide if the pattern they've laid out is a real signal or just noise.